let's start with you, Carrick.
Okay, my name is Carrick Long. I live in St. Louis, Missouri in the United States, and I am the organizer of the St. Louis Ember.js meetup. We meet once a month in person, meetup.com/stlember. If anyone from St. Louis is watching, come join us. Um, Aside from that, I heard about this Hangout on Twitter. I'm pretty excited to be a part of it. I was asked to prepare a presentation a few days ago. It's on very short notice, so it's not quite up to my usual standards, but I'm glad to help out the first meetup any way I can.
Cool, cool. So, a quick question: how many people are attending your meetup group?
We have about 8 to 10 regular attendees, and sometimes we'll get a few more.
That's cool. That's cool. Nice.
It's nowhere near as big as Ember, New York City, or Chicago or anything, but it's fun. So today I'm going to be talking a bit about component collaboration and services in Ember.js. I am Carrick Long, as I mentioned earlier. I organize the St. Louis Ember.js meetup. I'm also the lead front-end developer at a company called Second Street. You can find me online on Twitter, on GitHub, or at my own site at carricklong.com. So we've been hearing this word services being thrown around recently, but what does it really mean? What are services? In April, Tom Dale posted something on the Ember discourse forums talking about services. He proposed a way to take functionality out of your routes and controllers if it's not a core to those classes. These services are intended to be accessible from all the parts of your application. They are supposed to be shareable between different applications. It's ideal if they provide some sort of functionality. You don't want to just be empty objects. And they're also singletons that span the lifetime of your application. So when I say accessible, what I mean is think about Ember data if you've ever used that. You can just do this.get store from your routes or your controllers, and it really doesn't matter where you are. You always know the store and all of its methods are accessible to you. Imagine making your own service that could be as easily accessible as Ember Data's store. That's what this will allow us to do. Also, they're shareable. You wouldn't want to use services for something that's application-specific business logic. For example, if you're building a real estate listing app, a collection of open houses would be better suited for a controller. However, a geolocation service that maybe wraps the HTML5 Geo API would be a perfect candidate for a service because you can use it across all of your controllers or even in different applications. Another good example would be a Facebook service that wraps the Facebook SDK and allows you to access all of its methods from across your application or other applications as well. We also want to make sure that there's some sort of useful functionality. And the functionality that a service provides can range from giving you some sort of useful dynamic data, like with geolocation, giving you latitude and longitude as the user moves around, to more logic than you can shake a stick at, as long as it's all related. I don't know if you've ever worked with the Facebook SDK, but it's a beast, and it's one good candidate for a service, so we don't have to write all of that Facebook-specific logic into our routes and our controllers. And finally, these services are intended to be singletons. That means that Ember will instantiate a single object for your service using its create method, and then any configuration, initialization, data collection that you've done with that in any route or any controller will live for the lifetime of your application. That is the whole page load. That way, for example, with geolocation, if you're asking permission to get their location, you only have to do it once during your application's lifetime instead of requiring that you do it in every controller. Or, for example, setting up configuration with watch. So they're accessible, they're shareable, they hold functionality, and they're singletons. Unfortunately, they don't quite exist yet. There's been a lot of discussion in the forums. More recently, there was an initial pull request made to Ember as kind of a spike exploring what the code might look like. So here's an example of what the future of Ember services may look like. You would extend the ember.service object and call your service something service, much like you do with controllers or routes. So here we have an app.geolocation service and extends Ember service. And then there's talk about how to make those accessible from your routes and controllers. One example might be this.getServices.geolocation or services.twitter. There is a bit of a worry about how to keep the API backwards compatible, because in your controllers that are intended to proxy your models, if it has a services property or a services relationship, we don't want to overwrite that. So that's part of the reason it's still up in the air as to how we'll access these services and what's the best way to maintain backwards compatibility while still making it really simple to access your services. So Tom Dale says, I hope this can be a starting point for the community to start evolving our shared understanding of what services are. And that's really kind of where we are right now. The community is still trying to evolve a shared understanding and fully cooperate in the creation of services so that when they nail it, they get it right. Unfortunately, we're not always that patient, and kind of like in Willy Wonka, I want it now, says Veruca Salt. Luckily, there is a way that you can create your own services. Start off with an object. There's no Ember.service, so just extend Ember.object and write your logic in there with your, as usual with your computed properties and your methods and things like that. But there's no Ember magic to wire things up by name like with routes and controllers, so you'll have to do it yourself using Ember's dependency injection. This is what it looks like. It's a bit advanced, and it's not covered heavily in the documentation because, in general, in most applications, you don't need or shouldn't use dependency injection. But if you're trying to bring a whole new concept to Ember, like services, it can be a very appropriate place to manually hook into the dependency injection framework. So here we're using Ember's dependency injection to register the service in the container, and we're going to call it service:geolocation. That is a factory, which is service, and a specific one, which is the geolocation service. We pass it the class, not an instantiated object, and tell it that we want it to be a singleton. Then Ember's container will manage instantiating the class when it's needed and passing that same instance to all of the routes and controllers that might need to access it. Next, we're going to inject our service into our routes and controllers. So here you can see that before this initializer, we need to do geolocation. That way the geolocation service it exists by the time we try to inject it. So then in the initialize function, we are able to say n here is the name we want to use in our routes and controllers to access it, so this.getGeolocation. And L is the lookup key for the container, which is service:geolocation. That's the key we registered it with in the last step. So then we can we can inject it into any factory. So for example, if we do application.injectController and an L, that will make it available in every single controller. We can also do that with routes, models, components, all sorts of really any factory that the container can look up. So that's how we can get services today. But let's stop and talk about something completely different. How can component collaboration lead me to HTML's future? Well, before we can go into HTML's future, we kind of need to look at HTML's past. A lot of people have been using components as kind of a dumping ground where you say you have a blog post component, you pass it in some data, and it has a template and it renders that data according to your CSS and HTML structure that you want. But if we look at HTML's past, the real thing that we see is HTML elements that are used together, like ordered list and list item. In fact, some elements won't even function unless they're used in a specific way, nested exactly how they have to be. For example, select, opt group, and option. You can't use option outside of select. It doesn't make any sense. However, when you use select and option together, you get a whole lot more functionality. So that's the past. Now we're at the present with HTML5. But let's look at the future. The future isn't HTML6. It's web components, where we can define our own tags that hold their own behavior. We're not going to wait for the standards bodies anymore to create new tags. We're going to make them ourselves with web components. So what could this look like if we wanted to build our own custom HTML elements? Here's an accordion element that we are building with web components. We have an X accordion, and then there are a number of accordion items. And then inside of each item, there's an accordion title and some accordion content. And the desired behavior for this is that when you click an accordion title, it expands the accordion content and collapses the accordion content of all the other items. Or if you click the title of the one that's already expanded, it simply collapses it. And we can actually do this today with handlebars and Ember components. It looks incredibly similar, and in fact, when you get HTML bars, or when we get HTML bars launched, we will in fact be able to write our handlebars like this, and it will look exactly like web components should. But for now, we should stick with the usual handlebars component syntax. So here's what the JavaScript code for this would look like. We start with extending Ember component and using the same name we're going to use in our HTML, X accordion component. And we can actually give it a tag name, which is an Ember hook, so that when it renders the DOM node, it doesn't just use a div, it actually uses the X accordion tag name that we'd like to see in the DOM. This can lead to some easier ways to style things because there's less specificity on a tag name than there is in a class or an ID. So by styling on the tag name, it's easier for the consumers of our custom components to overwrite the styles when they're using it in their application. Next, we have the init and register item methods. So in init, we call super so we don't overwrite anything, but then we set a property called accordion items on this object, and it's going to be an array proxy. Now, what an array proxy does is it's actually a pretty great object. I recommend that you read its documentation in the Ember API guidelines, but basically the array proxy allows you to keep content and not only notice when an object has been added or removed from it, but when the entire array has been swapped out as well. With register item, we get that array proxy, that accordion items, and we can add an object to it whenever it's passed into this register item function. You'll see this later when the items will register themselves on this accordion component. Next, we have active item and toggle item. So active item is just going to be either null or a reference to an accordion item that we want to be the active one. Toggle item is another method where we can pass in an accordion item, and the logic here is basically saying, is the one we passed in already active? If so, then we want to make the active item null so that there's no active item and everything collapses. Or if the one we passed in is not already active, let's set that to be the active item instead. Next, we have the accordion item component. This is another Ember component, and its tag name matches what we used in the handlebars. It has an accordion computed alias to the parent view. So in Ember, you have this property called parent view, and it's reference to the view into which the current view is nested. And here's why that we're required to use an accordion item inside of an accordion, because the parent view of an accordion must be, the parent view of an accordion item must be an accordion. That way, when we initialize, we can register this accordion item with that accordion. And then finally we have a computed property to say that if the accordion's active item is this item, using the this dependent key, then we'll have is expanded be true. Next is the accordion title component. Its tag name is also what we used in the handlebars. The accordion item is aliased with the parent view, and then the accordion is the accordion item's parent view. So again, this must be nested directly inside of an accordion item, which must in turn be nested inside of an accordion. And then we have this toggle method, and notice the on click. So that way, anytime this accordion title is clicked, this method will fire. It gets the accordion, calls the toggle item method, and passes in the accordion item that this title belongs to. And then finally, the accordion content component with a tag name that we use in the handlebars. The accordion item is its parent view, so we have that alias there. And then finally, the last piece of the puzzle, there's an Ember hook in every component and view called isVisible. If isVisible is true in any component or view, it will be rendered into the DOM, but if it's false, it will be removed from the DOM. So we don't actually have to write any custom CSS or anything to deal with hiding. Instead, we just make it a computed property that aliases the isExpanded property of accordion item. That way, when the accordion item is expanded, which is based on the fact that the accordion item is the active item of the accordion, then the accordion content is visible, and it will render. Otherwise, it will not render, so you get the behavior of an accordion you'd expect. That's all it takes. Now we have this custom component. Actually, we have 4 custom components that work in tandem to provide one unified piece of functionality. They don't have any complex templates. They don't have any complex logic. They're all collaborating with each other because they know the structure you will use in your handlebars templates, and you get a lot of really neat functionality for free. So this is the part of the talk where I say, wait a minute, this has nothing to do with each other. Tie it all together. Show me a demo where we bring these two together. And unfortunately, I have to say that I did not come fully prepared for this Hangout. I only learned about it very recently. Normally I take a couple of weeks to prepare a talk fully, so unfortunately I don't have a demo ready for you to show. But it can work together in some really cool ways, and I'm looking forward to getting a demo recorded and put online sometime in the near future. But this would be a great time for me to take some questions if anybody has any.
Let's see. So we don't have anything in our Q&A app. Okay, I have a quick question. So have you used this kind of, well, not this accordion stuff, but like similar approach in the some apps that you have wrote in the past?
Yes, in my day job we develop a really cool software to enable local medias to run contests and promotions called the Promotions Platform at 2nd Street, and we use these same techniques day to day in our Ember application. So one example of how we're using services is to wrap the Facebook SDK, and that way we can make sure that we have this integration with Facebook's SDK, which uses callbacks and globals and all sorts of nasty things, and we wrap it in a single service where all the logic for Facebook lives. That way we can use it in our Ember application with promises and other niceties that we are used to in the Ember world. Another place where we're using it services in the day of my job is permissions. So we have the ability to log into our application, but your user might have different permissions based on what position you have at your company, whether you're the editor of a newspaper or somebody who's just promoting a certain contest. So what we do there is we actually do a component collaboration with the services. We have inputs that will disable themselves if they're inside of a custom component called a permission block. And that permission block reads the service's permissions and knows whether that model that we're passing in has, or whether the user we have has permission to edit that model we're passing in.
Oh, that is cool. I must say that this will be mostly a comment, but yeah, at this point I've only used like components as a separate things, and I haven't really thought about like grouping them together and just using them together. So yeah, that sounds like really cool stuff you're doing there.
The inspiration from this comes largely from Ryan Florence, who works at Instructure. They're a company that develops a piece of Ember software called Canvas, and they've released a lot of different Ember components. They have, for example, IC tabs, and those tabs work together in much the same way that this accordion component does. And if you've never watched Ryan's talk from EmberConf called The X Foo in You, it's another wonderful talk about how components can collaborate and work together, and you can compose your components in such a way that you don't have giant monoliths, but instead kind of start to mirror the way HTML itself works.
Is there a way to package components up and redistribute them to other people?
That is one of the Achilles heels of the Ember community right now. As much as we like to say that a lot of our stuff is reusable, most of that reuse right now has to come through copy-paste, because it's not yet easy to simply like make a Bower package and have your components be published and anyone can pull them into your application, because the Ember community is split between using globals and just including everything in one file, versus using Ember AppKit and using a custom resolver versus using Ember CLI versus using some sort of required JS or other AMD. So unfortunately, it's harder to package them up and distribute them. But if you put the source up on GitHub, most of the time you can at least copy and paste the services or the components into your own application architecture. Now, hopefully that will change in the future when Ember CLI becomes the official way to build Ember components, because then we'll have an easy way for those vendored components to get put into the build pipeline.
I actually have a second question regarding the services. The services are always to be consumed by other parts of the same application. It's not sharing functionality between different applications.
Correct. I mean, we're still in JavaScript, so I mean, it still relies on being in one window, so only one application runs in one window.
Sure.
So when I said shared between applications, what I really meant was share the logic and the code between applications, although each instance, of course, there's one instance per application.